My name is Rita Weeb, and thank you for joining us for this next in the session of Aging with Attitude. For those of us that have been following the episodes, Aging with Attitude it focuses on the demographic for 45 to 64. And this particular feature, we have a couple of people from the law community. And it's talking about family fractures and that sort of thing. And that is because, when we get to be in that age group, oftentimes we have parents that are maybe going into care homes. Maybe we have to enlist the power of attorneys, or maybe we need to get some help, and maybe some help needs to be given in getting those wills and power of attorneys and representation agreements set up. So with the first of our guests, we've actually got two guests. We've got Andrew Kemp and we've got Trevor Salini. And for the first one, I'm going to call on Andrew Kemp, because he is the guy that sort of talks and helps people through if the problems happen. And Andrew, I'd like to ask you, what is your area of specialization around this type of thing? And what are some of the general situations that you've encountered that people may need some help with?
I'm a lawyer in private practice in Prince George. I'm also a civil law mediator. Part of my practice is helping people resolve wills and estates disputes. So if you think of Humpty Dumpty, I'm the kind of person you call when Humpty is a little shaky on the wall, or he's fallen off and there's a pile of eggshells and goo on the ground, legally speaking. So for example, if a person has died and there is a dispute among his survivors as to who should administer the estate if he didn't leave a will and name an executor, or if one of the children wishes to challenge the terms of the will on the basis that that child did not receive what he or she regards as a fair and adequate share in the estate, that's the kind of work I do. And, well, many other things, but for the purposes of today's discussion, that's what I do.
Okay, and thank you. And next we'll go to Trevor Slaney. And Trevor, people have to get their paperwork set up properly. I know from personal experience that, oftentimes people don't get that paperwork set up properly. So what is the process? What's your area of specialization, and what's the process for getting that paperwork all set up right?
Thanks, Rita, for having me. So I'm Trevor Salini, and I'm a private practice lawyer here in Prince George as well. And I'm the lawyer you go to see when you're trying to set up the tools that are needed to either take care of you later in your life when you're not able to take care of yourself, or to handle your estate planning, which means the work that arises after you have passed away. If I'm not doing that and helping families and couples and individual clients to put together those plans, then what I'm doing is I'm helping the family members to administer those tools and to deal with those things and to administer estates after they have lost a loved one. So I'm the lawyer that you go to try to avoid having to go to see Andrew.
Okay.
And try to keep Humpty on the wall.
Okay. So Andrew, you're the guy that goes to court, right?
When necessary, yes.
Yes, and when mediation is necessary, you help with that as well.
Yes.
And is this often a very drawn-out procedure? Is it expensive? What happens? Is there a place that people can go to do it yourself?
That's an interesting question. So if you want to prepare your own will, strictly speaking, you're entitled to do so, but I regard that as a very foolish move. The next step up the ladder is probably using a will kit, which you can buy from stationery stores, places like that, or online help. Again, not the best idea. I regard those steps as penny wise, pound foolish. A good part of my practice involves correcting wills or trying to correct problems arising from wills which were improperly drafted. So a lot of those problems arise when people bring to me, usually after a person has died, this improperly drafted will, and then I find myself doing the steps necessary to try and correct that in accordance with the wishes of the deceased. Next step up from that is hiring a notary public to prepare your will for you. Unfortunately, a good part of my practice over the years has been correcting problems arising from wills which were drafted by notaries and poorly done. The next step up from that is having a lawyer who's a generalist draft your will. Usually they're reasonably good. No one's perfect, mistakes are made, The perfect world answer, where cost is always no object, is to have a specialist who drafts wills and prepares estates plans, which is kind of work that Trevor does, as the bulk of their practice. This is a tremendously complicated area, and the obvious problem is that after you're dead or incompetent, you can't fix it easily. Where if you were alive and competent and you'd changed your mind, your personal circumstances changed, it would be very straightforward to change your estate plan accordingly. That's why it's so very important to get it done properly early. It's the ounce of prevention, Trevor, versus the pound of cure, me.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's most interesting. So, Trevor, what about the family dynamics? Because oftentimes there's lots of power plays that come into being when, you know, somebody maybe is admitted to a care home, or somebody becomes disabled, or maybe even dead. Like, you know, the dynamics, the sibling dynamics, family fractures, how to prevent those things?
All a part of planning. You know, the overwhelming majority of people who do it themselves or draft wills with generalists or fill in the blank type service providers, they start with an assumption that sometimes is false. And that assumption is, okay, if I'm incapable of taking care of myself, then obviously I must have my spouse step into that role. And then obviously I must have my children step into that role, because I can't name anybody else besides them. It's their estate. Why not let them do the work? And that assumption is what leads to a lot of problems among families. Now, I've administered hundreds and hundreds of estates. And I've administered many estates that have been handled by children. Sometimes 2 children out of 4 or 5, sometimes 1 child in the position of power, sometimes 3 children doing it together, and sometimes they work out and sometimes they don't. It's not a factor of, you can't say it's not one size fits all, where if you have 2 children you can never put them together. That's not true. You can't say, oh, you can't put your child in a position because the other ones are all going to be mad. That's not true either. But I have seen clients who put children in positions of power over others, it lead to just problems, definite problems, and a lot of undercurrents of conflict are there that stay suppressed when mom and dad are alive. And when mom and dad are not there, those conflicts bubble to the surface, and then it's sometimes difficult to get through an estate like that. And if you do, sometimes it doesn't cost you in terms of extra money, but there are ongoing resentments there in the relationship that has to extend on well beyond the death of the mom or the dad. So I think planning can address that. Having a good, honest, open discussion with your lawyer about executor choice and attorney choice, and find out that you do have options that extend beyond the immediate family members.
And nobody gets any training for these kind of roles when they have to all of a sudden fit in as a executor or a representative or a power of attorney. There's no training, right? Or is there?
Not really. Do you mind? I'll jump in on this one, because Andrew and I were discussing this last night, and it's just amazing that if I wanted to have a job where I managed your money, I would have to go to school for a long time. I would have to be mentored and trained and licensed and insured, and I would have ongoing training responsibilities every year, and I would have to pay a tremendous amount of money to be able to educate myself that way in order to do that job. And yet somebody who I don't even know can name me as their executor, and I don't even know I'm named in that role. And that person could die with $1 million in the bank and 5 beneficiaries, and the will is read, and I find out I'm the executor. Suddenly I'm managing $1 million with a tremendous amount of risk if I don't do it right. And I'm responsible for accounting to these 5 individuals and doing it right. And those 5 individuals all probably think they could do it better than me and are mad that they're not named. And I don't have any course that helps me do that. There's no training. There actually is a course that I'm participating in right now, but it's only something that came into play a couple of years ago. And other than that, I'm not aware of any course other than getting some legal advice and having a lawyer help you through the process.
It's great information. Yeah. So Andrew, with what Trevor just said, how can you expand on that, or can mediation help with that? And
Mediation is well suited in many situations, particularly when you want to preserve the ongoing relationships which will survive the death of the deceased and the administration of his or her estate. It's easy to be confrontational, take no prisoners attitude if you're involved in a legal matter with someone you'll never deal with again. But when you're talking about the death of, say, your father, and you have 3 or 4 children in the family, and the dynamics inevitably arise, well, I'll say often, you have a choice of litigating it in the traditional manner, which can be very confrontational, very aggressive, but sometimes very effective, or people can step back and realize, well, there might be a cheaper, less confrontational, but equally effective way in resolving our issues. And if not resolving the issues, at least setting out a framework for the administration of the estate and the ground rules for the way people will deal with each other in future, not only during the estate administration, but thereafter. It isn't counseling. It isn't sitting around a table holding hands, singing songs together. It is an alternative to the traditional legal way. It can be very difficult to participate in a mediation for the parties involved, particularly when you're dealing with the death or incapacity of, say, a parent, because everyone's emotions are running high and no one's thinking as clearly as they normally do. Mediation as an option is available at any time in the process if the parties think it's appropriate. It just is a question of when everyone is ready for it. In some cases, early on, before matters blow out of control, it's great. Other times, you need to step back and frankly let the people go through a bit of catharsis, and then, when that is over, that's the time to start a mediation process in an attempt to resolve the issue before it takes on a life of its own.
Okay, so if a family is going through this kind of thing and all of a sudden somebody winds up in a care home and then there's a representation agreement on top of a power of attorney that isn't in trust and somebody has it, but the person is not incapacitated and you know, what happens then? Like, can you answer that, Trevor, or either one of you?
I'll jump in there. The gray area, well, sometimes you are incapable on a Monday and on Tuesday, or you're capable on Monday, you're incapable on Tuesday and for the rest of your life. You've had a stroke or a brain injury from an accident. But in most cases that I see, there's a gradual mental decline. And a person can be perfectly capable on Monday and Tuesday, and then not capable on Wednesday and Thursday, good for the weekend, and then they go, and eventually they have more bad days than good days, and eventually they don't have any more good days in terms of being able to cognitively understand what's going on. I've also had lots of situations where one child can visit with mom one day and get mom to say exactly what that child wants mom to say, and then the other child visits mom later on in the week and mom says to that child exactly what. There's power dynamics there, and each child has the best interest of mom at heart, but they both just think different things. And when people are vulnerable, you have to be very, very careful in that gray area. There's no amount of money that you can spend on powers of attorney and representation agreements and wills that can, or other planning documents, that can one size fits all guide you through that gray area. It's very difficult. You could do a power of attorney and a representation agreement when you're capable, and then in a moment of reduced capability but still somewhat capable but vulnerable, you can revoke both of those because you've spoken to somebody else and put another one in place. So it's a very difficult area to navigate. And just to follow up on that, the best you can do is have a strong relationship with a planning lawyer. Meet that lawyer privately without people in the room. Give that lawyer the instructions you need. And when you want to make changes, don't listen to this person or that person telling you to make changes, or take their thoughts into consideration, but then go and see that lawyer who will only take those instructions from you privately after a thorough discussion of the options, so that at least you know that if you're going to make changes, you're making informed changes that hopefully can't be challenged down the road.
I've heard of situations where, as a lawyer that holds these things in trusts and deals with these things, that you actually hold a power of attorney until somebody comes to you and and asks to have that power of attorney. Is that?
I do that, but that's not a standard of practice across the industry. So many lawyers do, but a lot of lawyers won't hold powers of attorney anymore because they're afraid of the liability. I like holding the powers of attorney, and if a child is coming to me to ask me for my client's power of attorney, who may be their mom or their mother or their father, they have to bring me medical evidence of that person's incapacity and show me their identification and sign a form acknowledging their receipt, in which case they would likely also ask me to sign it with them. And as my practice is to then talk to that attorney, that newly appointed attorney, before I put my signature next to theirs, which triggers the document, and I make sure they are fully informed of what their duties are, what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do, and what could get them into trouble, and how to use the important tool that I'm putting into their hands to take care of mom or dad, and how to protect themselves while they're doing it, and to make sure that they've abided by all the rules. Now, that's not a standard across the industry. There's various different levels, as Andrew was talking about earlier, in terms of do-it-yourself or going to a notary or going to a generalist. And there's a lot of fill-in-the-blank service there, and take your power of attorney home with a letter that says "be careful." So that's what I do, and there's a handful of lawyers in this town who do a fantastic job as well with trying to protect their clients in the way that I do as well.
Right. So I have also heard that, just having been a family member going through this kind of thing, that there are other entities out there that can help. One being maybe a trust company, public trustee and guardian. Do either of you have anything to say about those entities, or clergy people even helping with this?
Well, it's a question of what role you want them to perform. The public guardian and trustee of British Columbia is one person, but beneath that person is a large department, and their mandate is to protect the interests of the vulnerable in British Columbia. Infirm elderly people are considered vulnerable in the eyes of the law. That's no surprise. And so in some circumstances, when no one else is able to assume the role to protect the interests of the elderly or to administer their estate, the public guardian and trustee, or the PGT, can step in and do so. It's a trust company can be hired and appointed as the executor of your estate, if you wish, if in your family or in your circle of friends or trusted people, there is no one you think is a suitable candidate to do the job. It's not an easy job, and there are many factors you have to consider when determining whom to appoint as your executor. And remember, this person takes over after you're gone, and their job is described by the job description, namely the will, and that's it. So you have to pick carefully. So this is a situation where you might want, if there's obvious problems in the family, you have a black sheep in the family, you know that there's likely to be dispute for whatever reason. If you appoint the neutral trust company, at least you're appointing someone you know who will follow your wishes in your will, properly do what has to be done, account and distribute at the end, and if there is a dispute, they will know how to respond to that dispute as well. It's a difficult task, as I say. It's overwhelming to many people. It's always happening at a time of high emotions. You're asking a lot of your executor. Choose wisely.
If I could add to that, Rita, it's
I would love it.
very interesting that you mentioned clergy, because there's one particular estate that I had to administer where the family was quite fractured, and the children did not get along in any way, shape, or form, and the person who was doing their planning, not with me, with somebody else, appointed a clergy, a minister, to be in these roles. And I'm not saying that's a one-size-fits-all. It's just a good example of how you can find an arm's-length person with no skin in the game, with respect and integrity and honesty, and respected by the children, who didn't get along with each other, but all respected this person. And the way that this person negotiated those issues and stick-handled those awkward fights over everything, grandma's china and the wedding ring and everything, was just very, very skillful. And not that you should all run out and appoint your minister. Well, first of all, don't ever appoint anybody without getting their permission. and talking to them. But if you have a respected person, an arm's length person, it could be a brother, a sister, an uncle, a friend. Sometimes you may want to ask your lawyer to do it. Sometimes lawyers will do that. Sometimes I've had accountants agree to do the job as well. But always ask them first, and talk to your children as well. If you're not naming them, but you're naming Uncle Fred, or you're naming, the accountant that's been doing your work for years and years, that has agreed to do it, that knows the whole family, and they'll understand then, and they'll know that they have to work with this person when the time comes. But clergy was interesting that you said that, because it was just one of my most difficult files, where with that person in place, it worked out a lot better than it could have had one of those children been named to do these jobs.
Exactly. So, there is some options for people to choose from.
It sure is.
Yeah. So, with these thoughts, is there anything that we should maybe add to what we've already talked about today? We've talked about basically siblings having power over another. We've talked about maybe clergies and or trust companies helping to handle. Is there anything that sort of comes to mind that maybe we missed that people should be aware of?
Think first, act later. It's surprising, and yet it isn't. It's human nature in some ways, that in a time of great stress, it's almost as if it's a flight or fight response. People react instead of stopping and thinking about what they're doing. Handling an estate, if done improperly, can lead to considerable difficulties for the person attempting to help by handling the estate, or the estate itself. At a time, again, of high emotion, when everyone's upset and no one's thinking as clearly as they should, it's important to stand back, think it through, and if you have any doubt about what you're doing, and you should in most cases, stop and consult a lawyer right then. It might be that your situation is one of the happily straightforward ones, and you get a small amount of advice, it points you in the right direction, and it all works out. Of course, the problem with Trevor and me in particular, is in my practice I see a disproportionate number of the troublesome estates. There must be plenty which are resolved with relatively little disharmony, fracture, and other issues, simply because it was a close family, everybody was sensible, they were aware that the end was coming, they planned accordingly, the deceased had an estate plan, the plan was carried out, no problem. Unfortunately, even when you think your family is going to act that way, it might not always work out. I have seen plenty of those situations where people at some point tell me, I never thought it would happen to me. And I say, well, unfortunately, your number came up, it was just the luck of the draw, now how do we fix it?
So we've got about a minute each for final thoughts on it. So Trevor, anything that we've covered here, and just some final thoughts that people should be aware of.
Two things I think I'd like to reiterate. One, we've talked about the important point that you do not need to name the closest family member to you to fulfill these roles. If you think that it's going to create a power dynamic that's going to lead to a fractured relationship, you may want to rethink that and get some advice and consider other options. The other one that we haven't really touched on that I would like to make sure that I touch on is the fact that a good estate plan involves much, much more than just having a will. Somebody who has done a will a long, long time ago, that is a perfectly valid will, and is not, doesn't have mistakes in it or of any sort, thinks that they're covered. But I've seen much more wealth in my career pass by non-estate options like beneficiary designations and joint ownership on accounts, and those types of things can, completely take the effectiveness out of a perfectly valid will. So you need to think about more than just having your will in place.
Okay, those are wonderful pieces of words of wisdom. And so Andrew, just a half minute for any final thoughts from you.
The point I would emphasize is it's very helpful to speak to the people you will leave behind ahead of time about what your estate plan and wishes are. Many times I see people come to me and they're surprised at the terms of the will. I never thought Mom felt that way, as reflected by the gifts she made or didn't make in the will. It's an awkward conversation to have with your children, son, daughter, I'm going to die sooner or later. Here's what I own, here's what to find the assets, this is what's going to happen to them. It's particularly awkward if you have that one or more black sheep in the family and you're going to have to tell them, I'm sorry, you're not going to get an equal share. It helps in the long run, short-term pain, long-term gain.
Most interesting. Something for everyone to consider out there. So, this is dedicated to all those families that maybe have been hurt, family fractures, deep family fractures, or those that maybe want to avoid them. So until next time, my name is Rita Wiebe. I'd like to thank my guests, Trevor Salini and Andrew Kemp, and thank you for joining us.